For many Christians, there is a belief that has been quietly shaping their lives for years. A belief that sounds good. A belief that feels moral. A belief that most people never question. And that belief is this: if you are a good Christian, you should always be nice. Always polite. Always agreeable. Always gentle. Never confrontational. Never too bold. Never too direct. Many people grew up hearing something like this. Be nice. Don't upset people. Don't create conflict. Just smile and keep the peace. And at first, this sounds like good advice. After all, kindness is a beautiful thing. Gentleness is valuable. Patience is important. But here is the question most believers never stop to ask. What if the idea of being nice that many Christians were taught is not actually what the Bible teaches? What if trying to be nice all the time is slowly weakening your faith? What if it is quietly training you to stay silent when you should speak? What if it is teaching you to tolerate things God never asked you to tolerate? And what if this misunderstanding has caused many believers to live a version of Christianity that is comfortable but not courageous? Because when you read the Bible carefully, you begin to notice something surprising. Jesus was loving. Jesus was compassionate. Jesus was merciful. But Jesus was not always nice. There were moments when he spoke words that shocked people. Moments when religious leaders felt exposed by his honesty. Moments when his truth made others uncomfortable. There were even moments when his actions created conflict. Think about that for a moment. The very person who perfectly embodied love was not always nice in the way modern culture defines it. That alone should make us pause and think. Because somewhere along the way, many believers began to confuse two different things: being nice and being Christ-like. And those two things are not always the same. Being nice often means trying to avoid tension, trying to make everyone happy, trying to keep people comfortable. But being Christ-like sometimes requires something much harder. It requires courage. It requires honesty. It requires the willingness to stand for truth even when people disagree. And when Christians are taught that their main goal is simply to be nice, something dangerous can happen. They begin to fear confrontation. They begin to avoid difficult conversations. They begin to stay quiet in moments when truth needs a voice. Slowly, without realizing it, they begin to prioritize approval over conviction. They begin to measure their success by how many people like them, instead of how faithfully they are following God. And over time, this can create a quiet tension inside the heart. Because deep down, many believers feel something is missing. They want to live boldly for God. They want their faith to matter. They want their lives to reflect truth and purpose. But at the same time, they feel trapped by the pressure to keep everyone happy, to avoid upsetting anyone, to never say anything that might sound too strong. So they smile. They stay quiet. They try to keep the peace, even when something inside them knows that silence is not always the right response. And the truth is, this struggle is far more common than people realize. There are Christians sitting in churches every week who feel this tension. Christians who love God deeply. Christians who want to live faithfully, but who also feel the pressure to be liked by everyone around them. And so they live carefully. They filter their words constantly. They soften their convictions. They hide their boldness. Because they believe that being a good Christian means never making anyone uncomfortable. But the life of Jesus tells a very different story. Jesus loved people deeply. He healed the sick. He welcomed the broken. He forgave sinners. But he also confronted hypocrisy. He challenged corruption. He spoke truth directly to those in power. And sometimes, that truth made people uncomfortable. Sometimes it made people angry. Sometimes it created tension. Yet Jesus never avoided truth simply to protect his popularity. He never softened his message just to make people feel comfortable. Because real love is not always comfortable. Sometimes real love challenges people. Sometimes real love exposes things that need to change. Sometimes real love speaks the truth that others are afraid to say. And that brings us to a powerful realization. What many Christians were taught about being nice may not actually reflect the kind of love Jesus demonstrated. In fact, sometimes the pressure to be nice can lead believers away from the very courage their faith requires. It can turn bold faith into quiet passivity. It can replace conviction with approval. And it can slowly reshape Christianity into something far safer than the radical message Jesus actually preached. So the real question is not whether Christians should be kind. Kindness is essential. Compassion is essential. Grace is essential. The real question is this: Have we confused kindness with people-pleasing? Have we mistaken politeness for spiritual maturity? Have we been taught a version of Christianity that values comfort more than truth? Because once you begin asking these questions, you may discover something surprising. The call of Christ was never about being liked by everyone. It was about loving people enough to stand for truth, even when it is difficult, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it costs you something. And once you understand that difference, the way you see your faith may begin to change forever. There is a difference that many Christians have never been taught clearly. A difference that seems small at first, but can completely change the way a person lives their faith. It is the difference between being nice and being Christ-like. On the surface, the two appear very similar. Both involve kindness. Both involve patience. Both involve treating people with respect. But when you look closer, you begin to see something important. Being nice is often about keeping people comfortable. Being Christ-like is about loving people enough to guide them toward truth. And those two things are not always the same. Niceness often focuses on avoiding tension. It tries to make everyone feel good. It tries to smooth over difficult situations. It avoids saying things that might upset someone. In many ways, niceness is built around the desire to maintain harmony. But harmony is not always the same thing as truth. And sometimes, protecting harmony can come at the cost of honesty. Think about the situations many people face in everyday life. Imagine a friend making choices that are slowly destroying their life. Perhaps they are trapped in habits that harm their future. Perhaps they are making decisions that lead them further away from the life God desires for them. A nice response might be to stay quiet, to avoid bringing up the issue, to smile and pretend everything is fine. After all, saying something honest might make the conversation uncomfortable. It might create tension in the friendship. It might cause the other person to become defensive. So many people choose silence. They convince themselves that silence is kindness. But is it? Is ignoring a problem really the most loving thing to do? Or is it sometimes a way of protecting ourselves from discomfort? Christ-like love works differently. Christ-like love cares deeply about people, but it also cares deeply about truth. And because it cares about truth, it is sometimes willing to say things that are difficult. Not in a harsh way, not in a cruel way, but in a courageous way. True love does not seek to embarrass people. True love does not seek to shame people. But true love is also not afraid to speak honestly when honesty is needed. When you look at the life of Jesus, you see this balance clearly. He showed extraordinary compassion to people who were suffering. He welcomed those who had been rejected by society. He sat with the broken, the lonely, the misunderstood. But he never allowed compassion to erase truth. In fact, many of his most powerful moments involved both compassion and truth working together. There were times when Jesus forgave people with remarkable gentleness. But there were also moments when he spoke with startling clarity. Moments when his words were direct. Moments when they forced people to confront uncomfortable realities. And those moments reveal something important. Jesus did not measure love by how comfortable his words made people feel. He measured love by whether his words led people closer to truth. This is where the difference between niceness and Christ-likeness becomes clear. Niceness often asks the question, how can I avoid upsetting anyone? Christ-like love asks a different question. What will help this person grow, even if it is difficult to hear? Those two questions lead to very different choices. Niceness may remain silent when honesty is needed. Christ-like love may speak when silence would be easier. Niceness may protect temporary comfort. Christ-like love seeks long-term transformation. And sometimes transformation requires discomfort. Think about a doctor treating a serious illness. The doctor may have to deliver news that is painful to hear. They may need to recommend treatments that are difficult. But the doctor does not hide the truth simply to protect the patient's emotions. Because the goal is healing. The goal is restoration. And sometimes healing requires honesty. In many ways, spiritual growth works the same way. Growth rarely happens inside complete comfort. Growth often begins when someone is willing to face truth. And truth sometimes challenges us. It reveals areas where we need to change. It exposes attitudes that need to shift. It shows us patterns that are holding us back. If love refuses to speak truth, that growth may never happen. This is one reason Jesus often challenged people directly. Not because he lacked compassion, but because he cared too much to leave people trapped in harmful patterns. And yet, many modern Christians feel deeply uncomfortable with that idea. They have been taught that faith should always appear soft, always agreeable, always gentle in a way that avoids confrontation. But the life of Jesus shows a deeper kind of love, a love that combines compassion with courage, a love that welcomes people without compromising truth, a love that refuses to abandon honesty simply to remain popular. When believers begin to understand this, something begins to shift in the way they see their own lives. They start to realize that constantly trying to be nice may actually prevent them from living with the kind of courage their faith requires. They begin to see how often they have remained silent when something needed to be said, how often they softened truth to avoid tension, how often they prioritized approval over conviction. And recognizing this can be uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask difficult questions about our motivations. Are we staying silent because it is loving? Or because we are afraid of rejection? Are we avoiding hard conversations because it protects others? Or because it protects our own comfort? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary, because faith was never meant to be built around avoiding discomfort. Faith was meant to shape our character, to give us courage, to strengthen our ability to stand for what is right even when it is not popular. This does not mean Christians should become harsh or aggressive. Quite the opposite. The call of Christ is still rooted in love, patience, grace, humility. But humility does not mean silence in the face of truth. Grace does not mean ignoring what is harmful. And kindness does not mean sacrificing honesty. When these qualities work together, something powerful happens. Love becomes both gentle and strong. Truth becomes both clear and compassionate. And faith becomes something far deeper than simple politeness. It becomes a force that shapes lives. Lives that are not driven by the need for approval, but by the desire to live faithfully before God. And when someone begins to live with that kind of clarity, they often discover something surprising. The fear of upsetting people slowly begins to lose its power. Because the goal is no longer to be liked by everyone. The goal becomes something far more meaningful. To love people in a way that is honest. To speak truth in a way that is compassionate. And to live with the kind of courage that reflects the heart of Christ. One of the quiet consequences of always trying to be nice is something many people never notice at first. It slowly trains the heart to fear conflict. Not healthy conflict. Not honest conversations. But any form of tension at all. Over time, many believers begin to feel that if a situation becomes uncomfortable, something must be wrong. If someone disagrees with them, they assume they have failed. If a conversation becomes difficult, they quickly try to end it. Because deep down they believe that peace means the absence of conflict. But true peace is not simply the absence of tension. True peace is the presence of truth. And truth sometimes brings tension before it brings peace. Yet many Christians never learn this. Instead, they grow up believing that the most spiritual response in any situation is to stay quiet, to keep everyone happy, to smooth things over, to avoid saying anything that might upset someone. At first, this approach seems harmless. It feels kind. It feels gentle. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Believers start to lose the courage to speak honestly. They begin to hesitate whenever a conversation moves towards something serious. They second-guess their own convictions. They ask themselves questions like, what if they get offended? What if they think I'm judgmental? What if they stop liking me? And slowly, the fear of upsetting others becomes stronger than the desire to speak truth. This is where the problem begins to grow. Because the world we live in is full of moments where truth matters. There are situations where silence allows harm to continue. Situations where someone desperately needs honest guidance. Situations where the right words could change the direction of someone's life. But if believers have been trained to avoid all conflict, they may never speak those words. They may watch quietly while problems grow, not because they don't care, but because they have been conditioned to believe that love must always feel comfortable. Yet the life of Jesus shows a very different reality. Jesus did not seek unnecessary conflict. He was not argumentative. He was not aggressive. But he also did not avoid conflict when truth required it. In fact, many of his most important moments involved direct confrontation. He confronted hypocrisy. He confronted injustice. He confronted corruption within religious systems. And he did so with remarkable clarity. These moments were not driven by anger. They were driven by truth. Jesus understood something many people today struggle to accept. Avoiding conflict does not always protect people. Sometimes it protects the problem. Think about how many difficult situations continue simply because no one is willing to speak honestly. A toxic relationship continues because someone is afraid to set boundaries. A harmful habit continues because friends refuse to address it. A destructive pattern continues because the people who see it are afraid of creating tension. Silence can look peaceful on the surface, but underneath, the problem continues to grow. This is why courage is such an important part of spiritual maturity. Courage allows truth to enter conversations where fear once kept people silent. Courage allows honesty to replace avoidance. Courage allows relationships to grow deeper because they are built on authenticity rather than politeness. Yet courage cannot grow in an environment where believers are constantly told their highest goal is simply to be nice. Because niceness often prioritizes comfort over honesty. It protects feelings in the moment, even if the long-term consequences are harmful. Consider how often Jesus asked difficult questions. Questions that forced people to examine their hearts. Questions that exposed motives. Questions that challenged assumptions. These were not comfortable moments, but they were transformative moments. They created opportunities for people to see truth clearly. And once someone sees truth clearly, change becomes possible. Without truth, change rarely happens. But here is where many believers feel torn. They want to live with integrity. They want to honor God. They want to help others grow. Yet at the same time, they fear the social cost of being honest. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being labeled as harsh or judgmental. And in a culture that often values approval above conviction, those fears can become very powerful. But the deeper question every believer eventually faces is this: whose approval matters most? The approval of people or the approval of God? This question changes everything. Because if someone's primary goal is to be liked by everyone around them, they will constantly feel pressure to soften their convictions. They will shape their words carefully to avoid disagreement. They will hide parts of their beliefs to maintain acceptance. And over time, their faith becomes quieter, less bold, less visible, not because they stop believing, but because they fear the consequences of expressing those beliefs openly. Yet the early followers of Christ lived very differently. Their faith was not built on the desire to avoid conflict. It was built on commitment to truth. Even when that truth created opposition, even when it cost them comfort, even when it placed them in difficult situations, their courage came from understanding something powerful. Faith was never meant to be lived privately in a way that avoids all tension. Faith was meant to shape how a person lives, speaks, and stands for what is right. And that kind of faith will occasionally create disagreement. Not because it seeks conflict, but because truth naturally challenges things that are false. This does not mean Christians should look for arguments. It does not mean they should become confrontational, but it does mean they should not fear honest conversations. Healthy conflict can actually strengthen relationships. It allows people to express their thoughts openly. It builds trust because honesty replaces pretense. It creates space for growth. When two people care enough to speak truth respectfully, their relationship often becomes deeper. Because authenticity replaces politeness. And authenticity builds real connection. The fear of conflict often keeps people stuck in shallow relationships. Everyone smiles. Everyone stays polite. But important conversations never happen. Real struggles remain hidden. Real questions remain unspoken. Real growth never begins. When believers begin to release the constant pressure to be nice, something interesting often happens. They start to experience a different kind of peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone agreeing, but the deeper peace that comes from living honestly, from knowing their words are sincere, from trusting that truth spoken with love can lead to something better. And slowly, the fear that once controlled their voice begins to fade. They realize that disagreement does not always destroy relationships. Sometimes it refines them. They discover that honesty does not always push people away. Sometimes it earns respect. And most importantly, they learn that faith was never meant to be guided by fear. It was meant to be guided by truth. Truth that is spoken with humility. Truth that is carried with compassion. Truth that seeks restoration rather than condemnation. When these qualities come together, believers begin to live with a new kind of confidence. A confidence not rooted in arrogance, but rooted in clarity. Clarity about what love truly means. Clarity about the difference between kindness and people-pleasing. And clarity about the courage required to live a faith that reflects the example of Christ. When people think about Jesus, They often imagine a very specific image. A gentle teacher, soft-spoken, always calm, always comforting, always saying things that made people feel safe. And while there is truth in that image, it is only part of the story. Because when you actually read the Gospels closely, you begin to notice something far more powerful. Jesus was deeply loving, but he was not always nice in the way people today define niceness. There were moments when his words were direct, moments when his actions shocked the people around him, moments when his truth made others deeply uncomfortable. And yet every one of those moments came from the same place. Love. Not the kind of love that avoids difficult conversations, but the kind of love that refuses to ignore what is wrong. One of the clearest examples appears when Jesus encounters the religious leaders of his time. These leaders were respected. They were influential. They were seen as the spiritual authorities of their culture. Many people admired them. Many people feared them. Yet Jesus looked directly at them and spoke words that were incredibly bold. He called out their hypocrisy. He challenged their pride. He exposed the gap between their public image and their private hearts. He even used language that would shock many modern readers. At one point, he described them as whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled with decay on the inside. These were not gentle words. They were sharp, uncomfortable, confrontational, but they were also honest. Jesus was not attacking these leaders simply to insult them. He was exposing a dangerous pattern. These men had built an appearance of holiness while neglecting the deeper transformation God desired. They focused on rules while ignoring compassion. They valued reputation more than humility. And because of their influence, many others were being led down the same path. Silence in that moment would not have been loving. Silence would have allowed the problem to continue. So Jesus spoke with clarity. Another powerful example appears in a moment that many people find surprising. It takes place in the temple. The temple was meant to be a sacred place, a place where people came to seek God, a place of prayer, a place of worship. But over time, something had changed. Merchants had turned the temple courts into a marketplace. Money was being exchanged. Animals were being sold. The atmosphere of worship had been replaced with the noise of business. When Jesus walked into that scene, he did not quietly ignore it. He did not simply shake his head and move on. The Bible tells us he overturned the tables. Coins scattered across the floor. Merchants rushed to gather their money. Animals ran loose. And Jesus declared that God's house was meant to be a house of prayer, not a marketplace. This moment often surprises people, because it does not match the soft image many expect. But it reveals something important about the heart of Christ. Love does not ignore corruption. Love does not stay silent when something sacred is being distorted. Sometimes love acts boldly to restore what has been lost. Another moment reveals this truth in a deeply personal way. One day, Jesus was speaking with his disciples about what lay ahead. He explained that he would eventually suffer and be killed. Peter, one of his closest followers, reacted strongly. He could not imagine such a future. He loved Jesus. He wanted to protect him. So Peter pulled him aside and began to protest. He insisted that such a thing should never happen. But Jesus responded in a way that many people find startling. He turned to Peter and said something direct and strong. "Get behind me, Satan." At first glance, those words seem harsh. After all, Peter was not trying to harm Jesus. He was trying to protect him. But Jesus recognized something deeper happening in that moment. Peter's words, though well-intentioned, were attempting to pull Jesus away from his mission. They were encouraging him to avoid the path that God had set before him. And so Jesus spoke with clarity, not to humiliate Peter, not to reject him, but to correct the direction of that moment. And the story proves that this correction did not destroy their relationship. Peter remained one of Jesus' closest followers. In fact, he later became one of the most influential leaders in the early church. That moment of correction did not push Peter away. It helped refine him. This pattern appears again and again in the life of Jesus. Compassion combined with honesty. Grace combined with truth. Love combined with courage. He welcomed the broken. He forgave the repentant. He comforted those who were suffering. But he also challenged people when necessary. He asked difficult questions. He exposed hidden motives. He confronted patterns that were leading people away from God. And through all of it, one thing remained consistent. Jesus never avoided truth simply to remain popular. He never softened his message just to keep everyone comfortable. Because real love is not built on comfort alone. Real love is built on transformation. Transformation requires truth. And truth sometimes creates tension before it creates growth. This is where many modern believers feel conflicted. They want to follow Jesus. They admire his compassion. They admire his courage. But they have also been taught that their primary responsibility is to be nice, to never create discomfort, to avoid any words that might sound too strong. So when they read moments like these in the Gospels, they struggle to reconcile the two ideas. But the life of Jesus shows us something powerful. Love and boldness are not enemies. In fact, they often belong together. A love that refuses to speak truth is not the love Jesus demonstrated. The love he modeled was deeper, stronger, more courageous. It welcomed people exactly as they were, but it also invited them to change. It called them towards something greater, something healthier, something closer to the heart of God. And that invitation sometimes required honesty that was difficult to hear. This is why following Christ requires more than politeness. It requires discernment, wisdom, courage. There will be moments when kindness looks quiet and gentle. Moments when listening is more powerful than speaking. Moments when patience is the most loving response. But there will also be moments when love requires clarity. Moments when silence allows harm to continue. Moments when truth needs a voice. Learning to recognize the difference between those moments is part of spiritual maturity. It requires humility. It requires prayer. And it requires a deep understanding of the heart of Christ. Because the goal is never to win arguments. The goal is never to embarrass people. The goal is never to prove ourselves right. The goal is always restoration, healing, growth, truth spoken in a way that opens the door to transformation. When believers begin to see the life of Jesus through this lens, something begins to change. They stop measuring love by how comfortable their words sound. Instead, they begin asking a deeper question. Does this response reflect the heart of Christ? Is it compassionate? Is it honest? Is it seeking what is truly best for the other person? When those questions guide our actions, love becomes something far more powerful than simple niceness. It becomes a force that can challenge, heal, and transform lives. And that is the kind of love Jesus demonstrated again and again. A love that was gentle with the broken, but fearless when confronting what was false. A love that welcomed sinners, but refused to compromise truth. A love that cared too deeply to remain silent. There is a quiet trap that many believers fall into without realizing it. It does not begin with bad intentions. In fact, it often begins with something that seems good. A desire to be kind. A desire to be accepted. A desire to avoid hurting anyone. But over time, that desire can slowly grow into something much heavier. Something that begins to shape every decision a person makes. That trap is people-pleasing. People-pleasing looks harmless on the surface. It often appears generous, friendly, supportive. A people-pleaser is usually someone others describe as easy to be around. Someone who rarely disagrees. Someone who avoids tension. Someone who is always willing to say yes. But beneath that surface, something deeper is often happening. The people-pleaser is constantly measuring their worth by the approval of others. They are constantly asking themselves silent questions. Will this person still like me if I say this? Will they be disappointed if I disagree? What if they think less of me? And slowly, without even noticing it, their decisions become shaped by one primary goal: maintaining acceptance. This is where people-pleasing begins to conflict with faith, because following God has never been about gaining universal approval. In fact, the teachings of Jesus repeatedly show the opposite. There were many moments when his message challenged the expectations of those around him. There were moments when people walked away because they did not like what he said. There were moments when crowds that once admired him suddenly became hostile. Yet Jesus never reshaped his message to keep those crowds satisfied, because truth was more important than popularity. This creates an important question for every believer. What happens when the desire to please people becomes stronger than the desire to follow truth? The answer is something many Christians quietly experience. Their faith becomes filtered. Instead of speaking honestly about their beliefs, they soften their words. Instead of standing firmly for what they know is right, they remain silent. Instead of setting healthy boundaries, they agree to things that drain them emotionally and spiritually. At first, these choices seem small, but over time, they begin to shape a person's identity. The people-pleaser begins to lose clarity about who they truly are. They become so focused on meeting everyone else's expectations that they rarely stop to ask what God is actually asking of them. And this leads to something many people-pleasers know very well: exhaustion. Because it is impossible to meet the expectations of everyone around you. No matter how hard someone tries, there will always be different opinions, different desires, different standards. Trying to satisfy all of them creates a constant pressure that slowly drains the soul. Many believers living in this pattern feel spiritually tired. They feel overwhelmed by obligations. They feel stretched between competing expectations. Yet they struggle to change their behavior because they fear disappointing others. So they continue saying yes, even when their heart quietly whispers no. Over time, this can create something even more painful: resentment. A person may outwardly appear kind and cooperative, but internally they feel trapped. They feel unappreciated. They feel misunderstood. And because they never express their true feelings, those emotions continue to grow quietly beneath the surface. This is one of the hidden dangers of people-pleasing Christianity. It replaces authenticity with performance. Instead of living honestly, believers begin performing a version of themselves that they believe others will approve of. But performance cannot sustain a healthy spiritual life. Faith was never meant to be an act. Faith was meant to be a genuine relationship with God that shapes how we live. And that relationship requires honesty. Honesty about our limits. Honesty about our convictions. Honesty about what God is calling us to do. If someone constantly ignores those inner convictions to maintain approval, they slowly begin to disconnect from that guidance. They begin to follow the voices around them more than the voice within them. And the more this pattern continues, the harder it becomes to recognize the difference between the two. This is why spiritual maturity often involves learning to say something that many people-pleasers find extremely difficult. No. No to expectations that are not healthy. No to pressures that compromise personal convictions. No to situations that pull someone away from the direction God is leading them. Saying no does not mean someone lacks compassion. It does not mean they have become selfish. In many cases, it is actually an act of wisdom. Because healthy boundaries protect the space where genuine love can grow. Without boundaries, relationships often become unbalanced. One person gives constantly while the other simply receives. And eventually that imbalance damages both people. Jesus himself demonstrated this understanding many times. There were crowds that wanted more from him than he could give in a single moment. Crowds that wanted constant miracles, constant teaching, constant attention. Yet the Gospels show that Jesus often withdrew from those crowds. He stepped away to pray. He stepped away to rest. He stepped away to spend time with his closest followers. If Jesus had tried to satisfy every demand placed upon him, his mission would have been impossible. Instead, he remained focused on the purpose God had given him. And that focus sometimes required disappointing people. This is an important lesson for believers today. Following God does not mean meeting every expectation others place upon you. It means faithfully living out the calling God has placed on your life. And sometimes those two things will conflict. Sometimes people will misunderstand your choices. Sometimes they will wish you had responded differently. But living with integrity requires trusting God more than public approval. This does not mean believers should become harsh or dismissive. Kindness still matters deeply. Compassion still matters deeply. But kindness should flow from sincerity, not fear. It should come from genuine care, not the pressure to maintain acceptance. When believers begin to break free from people-pleasing, they often experience something unexpected. Freedom. Freedom to live honestly. Freedom to speak truth with humility. Freedom to build relationships that are real rather than performative. And perhaps most importantly, freedom to follow God without constantly looking over their shoulder to see who approves. Because at the end of the day, the goal of faith was never to please everyone. The goal was always to love God, love people, and live with integrity. And integrity sometimes requires the courage to stand apart from expectations, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it risks misunderstanding. Because the path of faith has never been defined by popularity. It has always been defined by truth. If being nice is not the full picture of what Christian love looks like, then an important question naturally follows. What does real Christian love actually look like? This question matters more than many people realize. Because the way we define love shapes the way we live. It shapes the way we treat people. It shapes the decisions we make in difficult moments. If love simply means making people comfortable, then silence will often seem like the most loving response. But if love means helping people grow, then sometimes love must look different. To understand this clearly, we have to look at how the Bible describes love. One of the most well-known descriptions appears in 1 Corinthians 13. It tells us that love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. Love is not proud. Love is not easily angered. Love keeps no record of wrongs. And love rejoices with the truth. That final line is often overlooked. Love rejoices with the truth. Real love is not afraid of truth. In fact, real love celebrates truth. Because truth brings clarity. Truth brings freedom. Truth opens the door for real transformation. Without truth, love becomes shallow. It becomes a feeling rather than a force that shapes lives. Think about the relationships that have helped you grow the most. They were probably not the ones where people simply agreed with everything you said. They were likely the relationships where someone cared enough to be honest with you. Someone who believed in you enough to challenge you. Someone who refused to ignore the things that could hold you back. Those moments may not have felt comfortable at the time, but they often became the turning points that helped you become a stronger person. This is the kind of love Jesus demonstrated again and again. He did not offer shallow encouragement that ignored deeper problems. He offered something far more powerful. He offered grace that invited change. Consider the story of the woman who was caught in sin. The crowd around her was ready to condemn her. Stones were already in their hands. Their judgment was harsh and immediate. But Jesus stepped into that moment and changed the entire atmosphere. Instead of condemning her, he turned to the crowd and said that whoever was without sin should throw the first stone. One by one, the accusers left. The woman stood there alone with Jesus. And in that moment, Jesus spoke words of incredible grace. He told her that he did not condemn her. But he did not stop there. He also said something else. Go and sin no more. Those words capture the heart of real Christian love. Grace and truth working together. Grace protected her from condemnation. Truth invited her into transformation. If Jesus had only shown grace and ignored the truth, the deeper issue would have remained unchanged. If he had only spoken truth without grace, the moment would have become crushing rather than healing. But when grace and truth came together, something beautiful happened. The woman was not defined by her past. She was invited into a new future. This balance is the heart of Christian love. It is compassionate, but it is also honest. It welcomes people as they are, but it refuses to pretend that harmful patterns are harmless. It offers forgiveness, but it also invites growth. Unfortunately, many people today experience a distorted version of love. A version that celebrates acceptance but avoids truth. A version that prioritizes comfort above transformation. A version that believes challenging someone is automatically unloving. But real love is far stronger than that. Real love believes people are capable of growth. Real love believes people are capable of change. Real love believes that honesty, when spoken with humility, can open the door to a better life. Of course, this kind of love requires wisdom. Not every moment calls for correction. Not every situation requires confrontation. Sometimes the most loving response is simply listening. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is quiet support. But when love avoids truth completely, it eventually loses its power. Because growth cannot happen where honesty is absent. This is why Christian love must be guided by something deeper than politeness. It must be guided by the heart of Christ. A heart that is patient with weakness. A heart that forgives failure. A heart that welcomes the broken. But also a heart that refuses to leave people trapped in patterns that destroy them. When believers begin to embrace this kind of love, their relationships begin to change. They become more authentic, more meaningful, more grounded in trust. Because people begin to realize that the kindness they are receiving is real, not a performance, not an attempt to avoid tension, but a sincere desire to see them flourish. This kind of love also brings a sense of peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone agreeing, but the deeper peace that comes from living honestly, from knowing that your words and actions reflect both compassion and truth, from knowing that your relationships are built on sincerity rather than pretense. And perhaps most importantly, this kind of love reflects the character of Christ more clearly, because Jesus never offered a shallow version of love. His love healed the sick, restored the broken, forgave the guilty, but it also challenged the proud, corrected the misguided, and invited people into a life that was far greater than the one they were living before. This is the love Christians are called to embody. A love that is gentle without becoming weak. A love that is truthful without becoming harsh. A love that seeks the well-being of others even when the path toward that well-being requires difficult conversations. When believers begin to live with this understanding, something remarkable begins to happen. They stop measuring love by how comfortable their words make others feel. Instead, they begin measuring love by something far deeper. Does this response reflect compassion? Does it reflect truth? Does it move this person closer to the life God desires for them? When those questions guide our choices, love becomes far more powerful than simple niceness. It becomes a force that can change lives. Lives that are no longer shaped by fear of conflict. Lives that are no longer driven by the need for approval. Lives that are guided by something stronger. The courage to love the way Christ loved. At some point in every believer's life, a quiet realization begins to form. A realization that changes the way they see their faith. They begin to notice that trying to please everyone is exhausting. Trying to avoid every uncomfortable conversation is impossible. Trying to maintain a perfect image of kindness slowly drains their courage. And eventually a question begins to surface. What if faith was never meant to look like this? What if following Christ was never about becoming someone who is always agreeable, always soft, always careful not to disturb anyone? Because when you return to the life of Jesus, something becomes clear. His love was deep. His compassion was real. His kindness was undeniable. But his life was not built around protecting his popularity. He did not adjust his message to keep everyone comfortable. He did not avoid truth to maintain approval. Instead, he lived with a clarity that many people today rarely experience. He knew who he was. He knew his purpose. And he remained faithful to that purpose even when it created tension. This is the kind of clarity that many believers are searching for today. Not the clarity that makes life easy, but the clarity that makes life meaningful. Because when someone stops measuring their worth by the approval of others, something powerful begins to happen. Their voice becomes freer. Their convictions become stronger. Their relationships become more honest. They no longer feel the need to perform kindness. Instead, kindness begins to flow naturally from a place of sincerity. They learn that love does not require constant agreement. They learn that honesty does not destroy healthy relationships. In fact, it often strengthens them. And slowly, they begin to see something they may have missed for years. The goal of faith was never to be liked by everyone. The goal was always to love people deeply while remaining faithful to truth. This is not always an easy balance. There will be moments when speaking honestly feels uncomfortable. Moments when setting boundaries feels difficult. Moments when standing firm in your convictions may lead to misunderstanding. But those moments are often where faith becomes real. Because faith is not proven when everything is comfortable. Faith is revealed when courage and compassion walk together. And this is the example Jesus left behind. A life that welcomed the broken. A life that forgave the guilty. A life that offered hope to those who felt lost. But also a life that challenged hypocrisy. A life that confronted corruption. A life that refused to compromise truth for the sake of approval. When believers begin to understand this balance, something inside them shifts. They stop asking a question that once controlled many of their decisions. Will everyone like this? Instead, they begin asking a far more important question. Does this reflect the heart of Christ? Does it show compassion? Does it show honesty? Does it move people closer to the life God desires for them? These questions bring a new kind of freedom. Freedom to speak truth gently but clearly. Freedom to set boundaries without guilt. Freedom to build relationships based on sincerity rather than performance. And perhaps most importantly, freedom to follow God without constantly seeking validation from the crowd. Because the truth is, no matter how kind someone tries to be, not everyone will understand their choices. Not everyone will agree with their convictions. Not everyone will appreciate their honesty. But approval was never the measure of faithfulness. Faithfulness has always been measured by something deeper. By the willingness to love people with both grace and truth. Grace that welcomes. Truth that transforms. When these two things come together, something beautiful begins to happen. Faith becomes alive. It moves beyond politeness, beyond surface-level kindness, beyond the pressure to maintain a perfect image. It becomes a genuine reflection of the heart of Christ. And that kind of faith has the power to change lives. It changes the life of the person living it. And it often changes the lives of the people around them. Because people are drawn to authenticity. They recognize when love is real. They recognize when kindness is sincere. They recognize when someone is courageous enough to care about truth while still showing compassion. This is the kind of presence the world desperately needs. Not more polite silence. Not more carefully filtered opinions. But believers who love deeply enough to live honestly. Believers who speak truth with humility. Believers who show kindness without abandoning conviction. And when someone begins to live this way, something remarkable happens. Their faith becomes visible, not through loud arguments, not through harsh words, but through a quiet strength. A strength rooted in clarity. A strength rooted in sincerity. A strength rooted in the example Christ left behind. So the next time you feel the pressure to simply be nice, pause for a moment. Ask yourself a deeper question. Am I responding out of love? Or am I responding out of fear of disapproval? Because real love is not controlled by fear. Real love is guided by truth. And when truth and compassion walk together, they create something far more powerful than politeness ever could. They create a life that reflects the heart of Christ. And that is the kind of life that leaves a lasting impact.